It makes no difference when men think of war. War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That was a quote from Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, a novel considered by some to be one of the greatest literary works of all time. Set mostly in the American Southwest during the late 1840s, Blood Meridian tells of an unnamed protagonist known only as the Kid. We follow the Kid as he runs away from home and makes his way to Texas before becoming involved in an ill-fated adventure down in Mexico. He survives a massacre at the hands of the Comanche, winds up in jail, and eventually is recruited into a gang of scalp hunters led by John Glanton and his second-in-command, the absolutely terrifying Judge Holden. The gang then proceeds to cut a murderous swath of destruction throughout northern Mexico before reaping their just rewards. There's a lot more involved, obviously, and I don't want to give too much away, but what many may not be aware of is that Blood Meridian is loosely based on real-life people and events, including John Glanton and Judge Holden. Yes, they and their gang of butchers did exist. Now today we're going to mostly focus on Glanton, an ex-Texas Ranger and war hero turned homicidal maniac. What was Glanton's early life like before he became a scalp hunter? Are the stories true of him waging a one-man war against the hostiles when he was still a teenager? And how did Glanton really die? Was it really as gruesome as portrayed in Blood Meridian? We'll also take a look at a young soldier by the name of Samuel Chamberlain. And you bet your ass we're going to discuss the true identity of the Honorable Judge Holden. So trust me, whether you're a fan of Blood Meridian or just morbidly violent Old West history in general, you are not going to want to skip today's story. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. John Joel Glanton was born in Edgefield, South Carolina in 1819. His father would pass away just a few years later, and Glanton's mother, Margaret, would move the family to Arkansas. It's there where she married a well-to-do plantation owner and settled down near present-day Augusta, Arkansas, not Georgia. And that's really about as far as it goes when it comes to the verifiable information regarding John Glanton's early life. The operative word being verifiable. That said, there are sources claiming that Glanton could be found living in Gonzales, Texas, with his family as early as 1835. Story goes that John was madly in love with a young orphan girl, and although the two were engaged to be married, tragedy struck in the form of a Native American war party. Glanton's bride-to-be was abducted and shortly thereafter killed and scalped. According to future author and Glanton associate Samuel Chamberlain, quote, "From this tragic scene, Glanton returned a changed man. He would often absent himself from the village, and when he returned, he invariably brought fresh scalps." End quote. Also, since this was Texas in 1835, that meant that the revolution was about to kick off in full swing. And per legend, a still teenage John Glanton enlisted in the Texian army under Colonel James Fannin. As such, Glanton would take part in the Siege of Bear, and following the Battle of Coletta and the surrender of Colonel Fannin, he'd also become a prisoner of war. Now, if you're a student of Texas history, you know what happens next. Degüello. Santa Anna decreed that all captured Texans, including our very own John Joel Glanton, were to be executed. And on March 27, 1836, exactly 3 weeks after the fall of the Alamo, these gruesome orders were carried out, with over 300 Texans slaughtered. And those who didn't immediately fall under Mexican fire were then cut down with bayonets and lances. Now, there were a few who managed to escape, at least 24, and according to dubious sources, John Glanton was among them. Of course, the Battle of San Jacinto would take place less than a month later as Sam Houston put an epic ass-whooping on old Santa Anna, thus winning the war. By the way, if you're looking for a thorough rundown of that particular fight, my friend Michael over at Texas History Lessons has just released a very detailed expose titled Victory and Death, the Battle of San Jacinto. Link down below in the description if you'd like to check it out. And speaking of Sam Houston, rumor has it he had banished Glanton from the Republic of Texas entirely, for reasons unknown. Apparently this exile was never fully enforced though, and rather than flee Texas, Glanton instead went ahead and took part in the Regulator-Moderator War. Long story short, there was a group of folks known as the Regulators who took to regulating the rampant crime over in East Texas. Only thing is, they took to regulating a little too far. This led to the creation of a rival faction known as the Moderators, who attempted to moderate the regulating of the regulators. The feud would last around 4 to 5 years and result in the death of some 40-odd participants. There were assassinations, pitched battles, a poisoned wedding cake. It was a big damn deal. One of the more interesting yet little-known feuds of the 19th century. It wasn't until both sides came together to fight in the Mexican-American War that hostilities finally came to an end. And like I said, John Joel Glanton allegedly was in East Texas during this feud and was said to have killed or wounded some of the best fighters on both sides. So with all of that in mind, let's just do a real quick recap of everything we've just learned. John Glanton arrived in Texas at some point in his adolescence. The family settled in Gonzales, but young John soon met with tragedy as his fiancée was brutally murdered by the hostiles. And for the next few years, Glanton just routinely goes on killing sprees to avenge her death. And that's in addition to fighting in both a revolution and a large-scale feud. But is any of that true? Now, I'll be honest with you. Many of these claims do not seem to be backed up with much in the way of evidence. And to me, at least, some of the stories are just a tad bit unbelievable. Like the one that I didn't even mention about how Glanton was already a captain in the Texas Rangers when he was just 16 years old. That said, according to author, professor, guitarist, and all-around Blood Meridian expert Aaron Gwynn, there are no primary texts on Glanton's early life in Texas prior to the 1840s. So while I suppose there is a possibility that Glanton did indeed reside in Gonzales and that his fiancée was killed and that he became some sort of teenage Old West Rambo, as of this recording, there's just no real proof of that being the case. Nonetheless, thankfully, things do clear up a mite once we skip ahead to the year 1841. There are official records of John being arrested at that time in Louisiana for shooting at a police officer, and then a couple of years later, in 1843, he applied for a land grant over in Jackson County, Texas. He was still living in New Orleans as late as 1845, though. It wasn't until the following year, 1846, that Glanton officially moved to San Antonio, Texas. He'd get married there that October to a lady by the name of Joaquina Menchaca, who, in addition to being the daughter of the former mayor, was also described as one of the most beautiful women in the Republic of Texas. It's also around this same period that Glanton enlisted with the Texas Rangers under legendary Captain John Coffee Hayes. Now, this was back when the primary role of the Rangers was protecting settlers from the indigenous. And truth be told, these early Texas Rangers weren't much more air quotes civilized than the Comanche they often found themselves fighting. A great description of Glanton during this period, and the early Texas Rangers in general, comes from the aforementioned Samuel Chamberlain. Sam joined the Army during the summer of 1846, and not long thereafter, his unit was shipped down to Texas, where, as fate would have it, he came down with a pretty nasty case of scarlet fever. Got furloughed out in San Antone, and it's there where he first cast eyes on Glanton, just in time to see him carve up a fellow ranger with his Bowie knife. Per Chamberlain, quote, "The bar room was crowded with volunteers, regulars, Texas Rangers, a few Delaware Indians, and Mexicans. The Rangers were the scouts of our army, and a more reckless, devil-may-care looking set it would be impossible to find this side of the infernal regions. Some wore buckskin shirts, black with grease and blood. Some wore red shirts, their trousers thrust into their high boots. All were armed with revolvers and huge Bowie knives. Take them all together, with their uncouth costumes, bearded faces, lean and brawny forms, fierce wild eyes, and swaggering manners, they were fit representatives of the outlaws which made up the population of the Lone Star State." End quote. So there you go. Early Texas Rangers not winning any beauty competitions, apparently. Chamberlain then goes on to describe an argument erupting between two of the Rangers who were sitting down playing cards. One was short and thick-set, his face bronzed by exposure to the hue of an Indian, with eyes deeply sunken and bloodshot, and coarse black hair hanging in snake-like locks down his back. His costume was that of a Mexican herdsman, made of leather, with a Mexican blanket thrown over his shoulder. His opponent was a tall, reckless, good-looking young ranger, dressed in a red shirt and buckskin leggings. A dispute arose. The short ruffian threw a glass of liquor in the tall one's face, who then sprang to his feet, drew his revolver, and placing the muzzle against the breast of the thrower, swore with fearful oaths that if he did not apologize, he would blow a hole through him that a rabbit could jump through. The threatened man did not move from his seat, but replied, "Shoot and be damned. But if you miss, John Glanton won't miss you." When he mentioned his name, a look of fear passed over the ranger's face. He pulled the trigger, but only the cap exploded. Quick as a flash, Glanton sprang up. A huge Bowie knife flashed in the candlelight, and the tall, powerful young ranger fell with a sickening thud to the floor, a corpse, his neck cut half through. Glanton jumped over the table and, placing one foot on his victim, said, "Strangers, do you wish to take up this fight? If so, step out. If not, we'll drink." As no one seemed disposed to accept his challenge, all hands went with him to the bar and touched glasses with him. The warm body was carried out, sawdust was sprinkled over the blood-stained floor, Glanton carefully wiped the knife on the leather sleeve of his jacket, and matters in the bare exchange resumed their usual course. I inquired about Glanton, for whom I felt a sort of admiration, in spite of my horror at his bloody deed, and learned that he was a famous Indian fighter and a desperado of the frontier, the hero of many bloody personal encounters with the outlaws of the border. End of quote. Now, John Glanton would have only been in his late 20s at this point, and already, according to Chamberlain at least, he's a famous Indian fighter. Unfortunately, I couldn't find much in the way of particulars regarding Glanton and his dealings with the natives during this period, but sources do show that he was causing quite a bit of chaos there in San Antonio. More on that in a bit, but for now, both Glanton and Samuel Chamberlain would go on to serve in the Mexican-American War. Chamberlain as a dragoon and Glanton with the Texas Mounted Rifles, which was pretty much just the Texas Rangers with a different name. Indeed, it's during this conflict that the Rangers earned their iconic label as Los Diablos Tejanos. And it wasn't just the Mexican army that the Rangers were making nervous. Even General Zachary Taylor was alleged to have said that while he was glad to have the Rangers with him on the day of the battle, he didn't want to see them before or after, just mostly due to how hard they were to keep under control. And this does jive with Glanton's actions during the war. While records indicate that he served with valor and distinction, he also had a bit of trouble keeping his murderous tendencies in check, as evidenced by him killing an unarmed civilian shortly after the Battle of Monterey, an action that caused General Taylor to order Glanton's arrest. Be that as it may, his commanding officer, William Lane, was able to give Glanton a heads up, so he managed to slip off before being placed into custody. Now, after this escape, Glanton may have possibly headed back to San Antonio. Stories abound of his wife becoming pregnant shortly after their wedding, and while there's not a ton of information available concerning their children, there are many sources alluding to an infant child that suddenly passed away while John was fighting down in Mexico. And per these stories, he deserted his unit in October 1846 to spend time with the grieving Joaquina. Then again, that's also about the same time that General Taylor ordered his arrest, so make of that what you will. Whatever the case, Glanton would soon re-enlist and serve throughout the remainder of the war, mustering out for good in April of 1848. Once again, Glanton returned home to San Antonio, this time to a hero's welcome. Only problem was, the man just could not stay out of trouble. Like the time in 1848 when he got drunk and attempted to murder a pair of Methodist preachers. Or that same year when he carved up a guy there on the streets after the poor bastard accidentally spilt water on his freshly polished boots. Hal Glanton would even be ostracized by the Texas Rangers for once again killing one of his fellow scouts. Maybe. We'll discuss sources soon, but like I said earlier, separating fact from fiction is not the easiest of tasks when researching John Glanton. There's also a story alleging that in November of 1848, he began arguing with a trio of soldiers there in San Antonio. They all went for their guns at the same time, and when the smoke cleared, one of the soldiers lay dead on the ground and the other two wounded. Glanton was supposedly acquitted by a court of law, but as I'm sure you can imagine, old John Joel was quickly beginning to wear out his welcome. And then there's a Dr. William Froebel. He paid a visit to San Antonio in 1853 and would recall hearing the following in regards to Glanton's reputation. Quote, "He was one of the most reckless and wicked of a band of murderers and gamblers, who for many years made San Antonio one of the most dangerous places. He shot men for sport on the high road." End quote. So yeah, pretty nasty dude to say the least, right? While it's unclear as to how many of these stories are true, what's not up for debate is that Glanton had the reputation of being a hard case. Luckily for the good citizens of San Antonio, it wouldn't be long before Glanton departed for good. That very same year that he was busy allegedly shooting at preachers and killing soldiers there in the Alamo City, a guy by the name of James Marshall struck gold over in California, a place known as Sutter's Mill. And it's this discovery that would usher in the Great California Gold Rush. And yeah, I guess even a hardened killer like John Glanton wasn't immune to dreams of striking it rich. That being the case, he and a group of 30 or so well-armed men left San Antone in either late 1848 or early 1849, bound for the California gold diggings. Now, sources do vary, but they all seem to agree that Glanton got sidetracked rather quickly, mostly due to running out of both supplies and money. In order to finance the rest of the trip west, he and his men simply offered up their services to the Mexican authorities. And by services, I do mean a good deal of cold-blooded murder. You see, the Mexican border state of Chihuahua had recently enacted a little something known as La Quinto, aka the Fifth Law, a rather drastic measure that legalized scalp hunting. Not only did the Fifth Law declare that war against the Apache was the first and foremost concern of the Chihuahuan government, but it also made it to where they could contract with foreign agents, like John Glanton, to bring the fight directly to the hostiles. Such agents would be offered a bounty for all Apache killed or captured, with prices ranging from 150 pesos for young boys and females, all the way up to 200 pesos for men over the age of 14. Like I said, it was just legalized scalp hunting, which really is just a nice way of saying legalized murder. Now granted, the Apache were most definitely a thorn in the side of the Mexicans, and had been for quite some time. Although, to be fair, the Apache felt the same way about the Mexicans and the Spaniards before them. Lots of wrong committed by both sides, no doubt. That said, let's not forget what your grandmother told you. 2 wrongs do not make a right. And it should come as a surprise to absolutely nobody that the scalp hunters did not stop at just killing hostile Apaches. By the way, this was not the first time that such drastic measures were taken there in the Southwest. Perhaps the most famous scalp hunter of them all, James Kirker, was also employed by Mexican authorities for several years prior to the war. Hell, even by 1848, John Glanton was not the only scalp hunter operating on behalf of the Chihuahuan government. Another American and former Texas Ranger, Michael Chevelli, had received a contract to hunt down Apache even before Glanton. Consequently, Glanton and his men would accompany Chevelli on a few campaigns north of Chihuahua City. It wasn't until mid-June of 1849 when Glanton secured a contract of his own. And boy, oh boy, did he hit the ground running. According to historian Ralph A. Smith, Glanton's campaigns during the remainder of 1849 were widespread, successful, and financially rewarding. If you've ever read Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, there's a scene where the gang returns to Chihuahua City in triumph with well over 100 scalps. They're dined and toasted by the governor and spend the better part of the next 4 weeks celebrating and otherwise terrorizing the locals. Now, like I said earlier, Blood Meridian is a work of fiction, but such a celebration in Chihuahua City did occur. To what extent they caused trouble for the rank-and-file citizens, I can't say, but Glanton and his men did indeed spend a month there celebrating and blowing off steam. Hell, they had such a good time that they burnt through all that hard-earned scalp money in just a few weeks and were forced to head back out once more in search of hostiles. One of whom was a Mescalero chief known as Gomez. I guess Mr. Gomez and his warriors had been causing so much trouble that the governor had placed a whopping 1,000 peso bounty on his head. Much like in Blood Meridian, the real-life John Joel Glanton did attack Gomez's village. And just like in Blood Meridian, they were ultimately unsuccessful in killing him. That said, Glanton and his men would remain heroes, for the time being at least, as they continued to bring in buku scalps. Just to give you an idea, by the end of 1849, the government of Chihuahua had paid out an astonishing 18,000 pesos for Apache scalps. And that's for all the scalp hunters, mind you, not just Glanton and his men, but still, that's a whole hell of a lot of killing. A fact made even more grim when you realize that not all of the scalps truly belonged to Apache warriors. Per Thomas D. Young in his book Geology of Being, quote, Apache hunting became more difficult, and the hunters found it necessary to supplement their haul with trophies from friendly agricultural Indians, as well as from Mexican campesinos or peasant farmers. In what one former ranger aptly described as a carnival of blood, Glanton's men also took to dressing and arming themselves as Apaches during their attacks on civilians in order to heighten fear of the Apaches and to drive up the price of scalps. End quote. So yeah, in other words, Glanton and his men were just going around killing whoever they could find. I guess they figured it'd be hard to tell the difference between an Apache scalp and one taken off of an innocent farmer. I mean, black hair is black hair, right? The ruse worked for a bit, but authorities soon caught on to Glanton's misadventures, and he and his men were banished from the territory. Hell, the governor even went so far as to place a large bounty on Glanton's head, just like the one he had put on Gomez. I even found one source claiming that the scalp hunters were attacked by a force of around 400 Mexican soldados as they were fleeing Chihuahua, and that they suffered substantial losses. How true that is, I do not know. But either way, Glanton and his surviving men were able to escape into the state of Sonora. Now, as crazy as this may sound, Glanton's scalp hunters were quite the racially diverse group of men. Numbers fluctuate, but at one point, according to historian Ralph Smith, the gang consisted of 30 Mexicans, 27 Americans, a runaway slave, and, interestingly enough, one lone Apache. And by the time Samuel Chamberlain joined up with them months later, the gang boasted of a large contingent of Cherokee and Delaware natives, as well as an Irishman, a full-blooded Comanche, and even a smattering of French Canadians. It was like the damn United Nations of cold-blooded villains. And yeah, like I said a moment ago, they were forced to flee into Sonora, where, believe it or not, they were once again retained by the local government. Despite the pay being much lower, a mere 50 pesos per scalp as opposed to the 200 they were getting in Chihuahua, Glanton and his men nonetheless busied themselves hunting down natives, and, pretty much anyone else with black hair that they could get their hands on. One of the more notable incidents there in Sonora occurred in late 1849 when the gang came upon the village of Tucson, just as it was being assaulted by Apaches under Chief Mangus Colorados. Surprisingly, Glanton and his men rushed to the aid of the villagers, charging through Apache lines and joining the beleaguered and outnumbered Mexicans. They then somehow were able to work out a truce with Mangus Colorados that may or may not have included a barrel of whiskey. Full disclosure, I had a very hard time nailing down the particulars of this encounter. Why did Glanton choose to make a deal with the Apache rather than fight? Were he and his men outnumbered or outmatched? And if so, why rush to the aid of the village? Why not just skirt around and avoid conflict altogether? Unfortunately, I could not find any answers. I do doubt that Glanton was just looking out for the well-being of the folks living there in Tucson, though, because in the days that followed, he and his men would descend upon a similar village and basically just terrorize the citizenry, riding roughshod through the streets like madmen before being chased out by merchants. It was during this same period that Samuel Chamberlain finally joined up with the scalp hunters. Now, Chamberlain's an interesting character. Originally from Boston, he ran away from home at the age of 14. Much like the mysterious kid in Blood Meridian, Sam bivouacked in New Orleans for a bit, and just 2 years later found himself serving as a dragoon in the Mexican-American War. Took part in the Battle of Buena Vista, as well as a few other engagements, but by 1849, he ended up deserting and joining Glanton in present-day Arizona. Years later, Chamberlain would write of his adventures in a book titled My Confession, The Recollections of a Rogue. And it's this book that would serve as a basis for Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. Now, if the name Cormac McCarthy rings a bell, that's likely due to some of his other books that were turned into movies that you've probably seen. Hits like No Country for Old Men, The Road, and All the Pretty Horses, just to name a few. While Blood Meridian is a fiction novel, I cannot stress that enough, many of its main characters, hell, the majority of its main characters, were real-life historical people, just like John Glanton. And according to Samuel Chamberlain, Glanton's second in command, a large, malevolent figure known only as Judge Holden, was real as well. Yes, you heard that correctly. The terrifying Judge Holden was, allegedly, a real person. According to Samuel Chamberlain, quote, in charge of the camp was a man of gigantic size called Judge Holden of Texas. Who or what he was, no one knew, but a cooler villain never went unhung. He stood 6'6" in his moccasins, had a large fleshy frame, a dull tallow-colored face destitute of hair, and all expression. His desires were blood and women, and terrible stories were circulated in camp of horrid crimes committed by him while bearing another name, in the Cherokee Nation and in Texas. And before we left Fronteras, a little girl of 10 years was found in the chaparral, foully violated and murdered. The mark of a huge hand on her little throat pointed him out as the ravisher, as no other man had such a hand. But though all suspected, none charged him with the crime. Holden was by far the most educated man in northern Mexico. He conversed with all in their own language, spoke in several Indian lingos, and at a fandango would take the harp or guitar from the hands of the musicians and charm all with his wonderful performance, and outwaltz any poblano of the ball. He was plumb center with a rifle or revolver, a daring horseman, acquainted with the nature of the strange plants and their botanical names, great in geology and mineralogy, in short, another Admiral Crichton, and withal an arrant coward. Not that he didn't possess enough courage to fight Indians or Mexicans or anyone else where he had the advantage of strength, skill, and weapons, but where the combat were equal, he would avoid it if possible. I hated him at first sight, and he knew it. Yet nothing could be more gentle or kind than his deportment towards me. He would often seek conversation with me and speak of Massachusetts, and to my astonishment, I found that he knew more about Boston than I did." End quote. And don't worry, we will return to the judge later on, including speculation as to his true identity, but for now it's still 1849 and the gang is busy terrorizing northern Mexico. Matter of fact, just a day after Chamberlain's arrival, Glanton and a few of the men headed out to cash in on their latest haul of scalps. Didn't go as planned though, and they would return a few days later, quote, "without money, 3 of the party wounded, and all mad as hornets," end quote. Turns out, on their way to trade in the scalps, Glanton had spied a camp of innocent Sonorans, just minding their own business. Guess he and his compadres figured they'd be easy pickings, so they disguised themselves as Apache and commenced to attack. Most of the Sonorans were able to flee to safety, but Glanton and his boys did manage to kill around 5 or 6, both men and women. They kept 2 of the ladies alive long enough to violate, but the following day, quote, "they in turn were surprised by another large body of Sonorans who took them for Apache. The unfortunate girls were brained at once to prevent all unpleasant discovery, and then with the fierce war whoop of the Tontos they charged their assailants with Indian lances, with so much fury that they gained a free passage." End quote. Shortly thereafter, a few more of the scalp hunters left once again to trade in their trophies, and this time they were able to do so without incident. Upon their return, a large party was thrown, what Chamberlain would describe as a proper orgy, and believe it or not, Glanton got so blitzed on tequila that he began preaching. According to Chamberlain, this was a real fire and brimstone sermon, during which Glanton proclaimed that he and his men were all sinners and damned to an eternity in hell. He, Glanton, then knelt down and in well-chosen words prayed with all the fervor of a hard-shell Baptist preacher for the salvation of all. Suddenly he sprang up and, drawing his revolver, opened fire on us right and left. One of the Canadians received a shot in the leg, a gentle reminder to flee from the wrath to come. Judge Holden seized the madman in his powerful arms, laid him down and soothed him as a mother would a fretful child, and Glanton soon sank into a drunken sleep. End quote. So yeah, real stable guy, John Joel Glanton. Totally normal, non-psychotic behavior. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, Glanton and his men wore down their welcome there in Sonora just as quickly as they did back in Chihuahua. That being the case, they were soon on the move yet again, this time in search of the mythical city of El Dorado, a quest that was somewhat derailed by a large contingent of pissed-off Apache. Samuel Chamberlain describes this attack in detail in his memoirs, My Confession, but long story short, although the scalp hunters were initially taken by surprise, they still managed to drive off their attackers, momentarily at least. The only problem was they were still out in the open and highly outnumbered, so they beat feet, or hooves I guess I should say, for a grove of pecans along a creek bed some 2 miles in the distance. And that's when the Apache really came at them in full force. Of the 38 men who started for the grove, only 24 made it to safety, and of those 24, 7 were wounded, 4 of them fatally. Glanton urged his men not to open up fire until he gave the word, and that word came once the warriors were within 200 yards, at which point, according to Chamberlain, quote, "a deadly volley was poured in, and then 12 of us sprang on our horses and charged at them before they could regain their ponies. The result was most glorious. We regained the grove without loss, while 17 Indians lay on the plain, and several warriors had to be helped into the saddle. The Apaches had had enough. Their sentinels withdrew, and the entire party disappeared among the yuccas and the rocks to the south." End of quote. So not a bad showing by the scalp hunters, but like I mentioned a second ago, they had lost quite a few men, and of the 4 who were mortally wounded, Glanton ordered them to be put down like dogs, stating that not only was it a mercy, but that their injuries would put the rest of the men at risk. Lots were drawn to determine who the executioners would be, and the 4 wounded were then dispatched with Apache war clubs, an action later described by Chamberlain as a terrible sacrifice on the altar of necessity. And I don't know about you, but I plan on using that exact line anytime I have to do some trivial task that I don't feel like doing. Gotta wash the dishes or fold laundry? Just another terrible sacrifice on the altar of necessity. Following this battle with the Apache, the scalp hunters would push west to the Colorado River where, at long last, they finally located the fabled city of El Dorado. Kind of. Truth is, there weren't no city of gold, but there was a very lucrative ferry business there on the Colorado, not far from present-day Yuma, Arizona. Now, Yuma, or Fort Yuma, was first established in 1849 as Camp Calhoun. It also happened to be a very popular river crossing for would-be prospectors headed to California. Hell, there were so many people fording the river there at Camp Calhoun that the Army just went ahead and built a ferry. They would temporarily abandon the fort in January of 1850 and leave the ferry, which by that time was known as the Yuma Crossing, to an enterprising businessman by the name of Dr. Abel Lincoln, not to be confused with the future president. And Doc Lincoln did find it to be quite the prosperous affair. Dude was just basically printing money. Not only that, but he also got along well with the neighboring Quitsan or Yuma people. At least he did before the unfortunate arrival of John Glanton. Now, at first, Lincoln, not really knowing who he was dealing with, figured that he could use the gang's help in operating the ferry. This backfired, obviously, and in no time flat, Glanton just strong-armed his way into taking over the entire operation. And you know what that means. At first, Glanton just increased the price of the ferry, but it wasn't long before he and his men took to harassing and then just outright killing and robbing innocent travelers. Skip ahead to the spring of 1850, and a General Anderson from Tennessee passed through with a large group of migrating Americanos. I guess Anderson didn't much care for Glanton's attitude, so he moved downriver a ways and had the Quitsan construct a boat for him and his people. And to add insult to injury, once safely on the other side, Anderson presented this vessel to the natives, who commenced operating their own ferrying business, much to John Glanton's disgust. Worth noting that during this period, it was not just Americans who sought passage across the Colorado River. A good deal of prospectors hailed from the Mexican state of Sonora, and they, much like Anderson, really weren't all that keen on doing business with the filthy scalp hunters. As such, they took to using the other ferry operated by the Quitsan, thus further infuriating Glanton. Now, somewhere along the line, an Irishman by the name of Callahan got himself murdered. In the novel Blood Meridian, Callahan helps to operate the Quitsan ferry, but, quote, within days it was burned, and Callahan's headless body floated anonymously downriver, a vulture standing between the shoulder blades in clerical black, silent rider to the sea, end quote. Truth is, I'm not sure if anyone knows exactly who was responsible for Callahan's death. Some historical sources do back up McCarthy's narrative that Glanton was to blame, while others assert that it was the Yuma who did the poor bastard in, and that in all reality Callahan had been working for Glanton. Whichever way it shook out, I think it's clear that tensions were mounting there on the Colorado. Finally, one of the big Quitsan chiefs paid the gang a visit looking to smooth matters over, but it weren't no use. A high-headed Glanton declared that going forward his men would kill one Quitsan for every person they dare ferry across the river. Still hoping for a compromise, the chief proposed that his people just stick to ferrying animals, at which point Glanton picked up a large stick and smashed it down over the chief's head, unwittingly signing his own death warrant in the process. Sure enough, not long thereafter, towards the end of April 1850, as the gang slept in a drunken midday stupor, the Quitsan arose in righteous anger, slaughtering Glanton and damn near all of his men. Even poor Doc Lincoln fell prey to the carnage, his body thrown in a large fire right alongside Glanton's. Now, not everybody was killed. There were a few survivors like Samuel Chamberlain. Hell, according to Chamberlain, he had been thinking of deserting even before the massacre. Quote, another disgusting orgy was indulged in by Glanton and most of his band, which now numbered only 15. I had become so thoroughly horrified with the hellish deeds of my companions that dread feelings akin to the nightmare took possession of me, making my days miserable and my nights a series of fearful dreams. I sounded Ben Tobin, Hitchcock, and Long Webster on the subject of quitting the gang and going to the mines in California. They were as disgusted as myself, and we agreed to start whenever a favorable opportunity presented itself and formed our plans accordingly. End quote. And yeah, I guess that massacre at the hands of the Yuma presented such an opportunity. When the attack began, Chamberlain and his co-conspirators, Tobin, Hitchcock, and Webster, were all away from camp down by the river and were thus able to escape the carnage. Miraculously, they were not alone. As Chamberlain and his companions began to flee across the desert, they were amazed to see a large form running behind them in the distance. Turns out it was Judge Holden, keeping a dozen or so warriors at bay by swinging his damn rifle like a club. Chamberlain begrudgingly came to Holden's aid, but later on down the trail, the judge returned the favor by attempting to steal Chamberlain's horse and threatening to out him as a murderer to the authorities. I'll spare you all the details, but long story short, Chamberlain and the others ended up leaving the judge behind, unarmed and on foot, as they themselves pushed on ahead to civilization. They're eventually rescued by some friendly natives, ironically, and as they're laid up recuperating, they're astonished to wake up one morning and find the judge right there in camp, just sitting calmly, seemingly no worse for the wear, and cooking some meat over a fire. Turns out Holden had made his way to the village on his own, and upon arrival, he located Tobin's mule and butchered it right there on the spot, hence the cooking meat. At first, Chamberlain and the others considered killing the son of a bitch, but I guess their hunger got the better of them, so they simply joined Holden by the fire and filled their gullets on mule flesh. It wasn't until the following day that they departed the village, sans Judge Holden, making it abundantly clear that if he so much as thought about following them, they'd gun him down. Quote, "On the third day, we decided to start for the settlements, informing Holden that he could not go with us, but must remain one day after we left. After a tedious march of 6 hours over a barren, rocky country, and some miles of it through a narrow pass, we reached the Indian rancheria of San Felipe, where we found grass and water. Here our Indians met us with 2 beeves, and we found they had only paid $4 for both. We killed one, made a good meal of its lean, stringy meat, cut off some of the best pieces to pack along, and gave the rest to the Indians and the live one to its driver for his troubles." End of quote. And believe it or not, that's also the end of Samuel Chamberlain's My Confession, Recollections of a Rogue. Seriously, that's just how the book ends, with zero explanation as to the fate of Judge Holden or anybody else for that matter. Now, just real quick, let's circle back to the death of John Glanton. How exactly did he die? Well, like I said, he was killed by the Yuma, more specifically, as the result of some type of blunt force trauma to the head. Was it a war club or a rock or even a hatchet? I don't know, but all 3 are listed by various sources as the means of death. And of course, then his body was thrown into a large fire and incinerated. Speaking of sources, if you're looking for a factual, historically accurate, and in-depth book on John Joel Glanton and the scalp hunters, well, you, my friend, are mostly shit out of luck. Sadly, there is no such comprehensive resource available on Glanton, at least not that I could find. You've basically just got to scour dozens of different accounts and just kind of piece the story together. Now, me personally, I found John Sepic's notes on Blood Meridian to be a wealth of information. But even then, his book isn't really meant to be a definitive history on the Glanton gang. It's just more of a companion piece to the fictional Blood Meridian. Nevertheless, Mr. Sepic does list quite a few historical sources, some of which I was able to find and others not so much. A lot of the stuff on Glanton seems to either just be out of print or really hard for an amateur like myself to locate. I did get my hands on a couple of essays written by historian Ralph Smith, though, as well as Thomas D. Young's Cormac McCarthy and the Geology of Being. Much like Sepic's notes, the Geology of Being is mostly a companion piece to Blood Meridian, but Smith does include an excellent rundown of Glanton's life in the appendix. And just to give you more of an idea of where a lot of the information on Glanton comes from, Thomas Young writes in part that there are 5 primary sources for Glanton's life and career. For his years as a Texas Ranger up through his service in the Mexican War, the reminiscence of his fellow Rangers, Mustang Gray, Rip Ford, Walter P. Lane, and Horace Bell. And for his demise on the Colorado, you've got Horace Bell once again, M.L. Crimmins, and Ralph Smith. Young also notes, quote, "As McCarthy himself consistently demonstrates, all such narratives are both speculative and by necessity provisional." End quote. In other words, even when it comes to the source material, it's hard to tell where the truth ends and the fiction begins. Now, one of the guys you just heard me mention, M.L. Crimmins, has an essay titled John Glanton of San Antonio that I also found to be extremely informative. In addition to that and the other sources I've already mentioned, I also consulted several articles written by Professor Aaron Gwynn. Now, I mentioned Gwynn earlier, but his Substack, The Night Does Not End, is absolutely chock full of historical notes on the real Glanton gang, as well as interesting tidbits and insights into the novel Blood Meridian. If you're a fan of Cormac McCarthy or just obscure Old West history, his blog is a must-read. Link down below in the description. And honestly, if all you do is just read Blood Meridian, then you will come away with a somewhat decently accurate description of Glanton and the gang. There's some fluff thrown in, obviously. It's a work of fiction. Some of the characters were simply made up for the book. The kid, for instance, is sort of a stand-in for Samuel Chamberlain, and probably Jesus Christ himself, depending on your interpretation. And of course, there's also a bit of supernatural thrown in with the judge, but still, many of the events that McCarthy writes about did happen. And more often than not, he does a pretty good job of sticking to the history. And finally, we've got the original primary source, the granddaddy of them all, Samuel Chamberlain's My Confession, which, FYI, also just happens to be the one and only source for Judge Holden's existence. Now, officially, My Confession is considered to be nonfiction. Samuel Chamberlain was a real person, and he absolutely did serve in the Mexican-American War. But whether or not he was really a member of the Glanton gang remains to be seen. I actually reached out to Professor Gwynn and asked him point blank, do you think that Chamberlain rode with Glanton, or was he just full of shit? And Gwynn replied, quote, it's hard to say. Some believe that My Confession is a forgery, a literary fraud. Once you start looking into its publication history, things start to fall apart. End of quote. Even the respected historian Walter P. Webb strongly denounced Chamberlain's memoir as a hoax. And that may be the case. After all, Chamberlain for sure made up a few fibs, greatly exaggerating his actions, not just in the war, but also in regard to his various romantic endeavors. Two was having threesomes like the rest of us change underwear. That said, on May 9th, 1850, just a couple of weeks after the death of John Glanton, 3 Americans did appear before the Los Angeles alcalde, stating that they were survivors of the Yuma Crossing massacre. These men gave their names as Joseph Anderson, William Carr, and Marcus Webster. One of them, Carr, ended up giving a pretty thorough deposition. It still exists, you can read it, and he gave a very similar account to the one told by Sam Chamberlain in My Confession. And both Joseph Anderson and Marcus Webster would sign Carr's deposition, swearing to its veracity. There are some who think that maybe, just maybe, Samuel Chamberlain was one of these guys, possibly even Carr, and just going by an alias. Remember, Chamberlain was a deserter, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that he'd use a false name when speaking with the authorities, especially after riding with a bunch of damn scalp hunting murderers. As far as his book being a hoax, I haven't really gone down that particular rabbit hole just yet, but it is worth mentioning that if Chamberlain was lying, then that means there's the chance that Judge Holden did not exist. Then again, if Chamberlain was telling the truth, then that means that the literal embodiment of evil, one of the most frightening Old West figures of all time, Judge Holden, not only survived the massacre at Yuma, but then went on to do devil only knows what else. Which begs the question, if the judge was real, what was his true identity? The reality is that nobody knows, but I figured I'd at least do a quick rundown of the most popular suspects and share my own opinion. First up, we got a guy by the name of Charles Wilkins Weber. Much like the judge, Weber was an educated man. Came to Texas shortly after the Revolution and spent time with the Rangers, after which he returned back east and studied medicine and theology. By 1849, Weber was back out west and leading a mining expedition in Arizona, not far from where the Yuma massacre would go down. This proved to be a very short-lived expedition, and from what I understand, Weber doesn't pop back up until 1854 when he's attempted to introduce camels to the American Southwest. And then just a year later, he would die fighting as a filibuster down in Nicaragua. So, we know that Weber was highly educated, well-versed in theology and science, but at the same time, he also rode with rough sorts like the Texas Rangers, and he died a violent death as a revolutionary. But what exactly was Weber up to in between that failed expedition in 1849 and his foray into the camel business in 1854? Could he have been riding with Glanton under the name Judge Holden? And here's the crazy part. Weber was known to operate under various false names, and one of them, on at least one occasion, was Holden. And if that's not creepy enough for you, Mr. Weber also wrote a book titled Spiritual Vampirism. It's absolutely full of the type of batshit crazy stuff that Holden would say in My Confession. Another contender is fur trapper and explorer Joseph R. Walker. He fits the bill as far as being a large man, a practitioner of violence, and fluent in several dialects, but in my opinion, that's about as far as it goes. I'm not as much of an expert on Walker as I should be, so what I'm about to say might turn out to bite me in the ass, but I don't think he was really known for his cruelty. From everything I've read about the guy, he was just a very capable and well-respected mountain man. Theirs was a violent life by nature, so Walker was forced to take lives on occasion. But was he a bloodthirsty maniac like Judge Holden? And for that matter, was he educated like the judge? I don't know, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that he's most likely not our man. And then we've got Charles W. Holden, publisher of Holden's Dollar magazine. Mr. Holden hailed from Massachusetts, and at one point he did venture out west to try his luck in the California mines. Only thing is, there has been an obituary located, and if it's accurate, that Charles Holden died in mid-1848, which would mean that he passed far too early to be our Judge Holden. Now, this next little bit isn't really all that important, but weirdly enough, Charles W. Holden died on June 13th, the same month and day that the great Cormac McCarthy also crossed the Veil. Next up, there's Michael Chevelli. If you'll recall, we mentioned him earlier. He's the ex-Texas Ranger that Glanton originally rode with when he first started hunting scalps. However, Chevelli supposedly left Mexico before Glanton and his gang even went into Sonora, and he would go on to die in California in 1852. So if he was Judge Holden, then he didn't live much longer after that Yuma massacre. Then again, I do find it curious that he would ride for Glanton as opposed to Glanton continuing to ride for him, as Chevelli, from what I can tell, was the more experienced and stable of the two, but who knows. Another contender is Dr. John Allen Veach. Dr. Veach was highly educated, very large, standing at 6 foot 4 inches tall, and he did spend time as a scalp hunter in 1849. Not only that, but evidence shows that Veach may have led his own scalp hunting expeditions, one of which got wiped out with him being the lone survivor. And he, just like Glanton, did have a contract with the Sonoran government. Later on, Veach would become well known for discovering deposits of borax in Northern California. And the list of possible Judge Holdens goes on and on. Hell, I've even seen Bigfoot Wallace thrown around as a possibility. Wallace, of course, is a legendary figure in Texas history, a well-respected frontiersman who did do some shady stuff, but I'm not sure there's any indication that he rode with the likes of John Joel Glanton. At the end of the day, we're all just speculating. Until somebody uncovers additional information on Holden outside of Samuel Chamberlain's My Confession, that's really all we can do, speculate. Just from the list I rattled off, I'd say that either Charles Weber or Dr. Veach are the most likely suspects, but once again, that's just a guess. I don't know who the real Judge Holden was, or even if he really existed. And honestly, I don't think it really matters. Here's the thing. What Judge Holden represented, and hell, even what John Glanton represented for that matter, in my opinion, was unbridled evil. And the sad fact of the matter is, evil not only existed in the American Southwest during the 19th century, but it's alive and well even to this day. So I guess in that sense, the judge never did die. He's still out there, as Cormac McCarthy would put it, dancing. You know, you turn on the news and every other story is about some sick fuck who's hurt or otherwise desecrated a child. I saw a photo online the other day of a little girl that was starving to death, and this was a recent photo from this month. What the hell are we doing as a society in the year 2024 that we allow children to starve to death? There are wars, rumors of wars, mass shootings, and just all manner of evil seemingly being conducted on a daily basis worldwide. And that's just the big stuff. We've got diseases, illnesses, divorce, overdoses, car accidents, home foreclosures, you name it. Tragedies both big and small occurring every minute of every fucking day. It can be very hard to wrap our minds around such things, and I do think if you focus on this stuff too much, you'll find yourself in a very dark place, much like the darkness abundantly found in Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. In spite of all of that, though, I do not think it's hopeless. In fact, I believe the exact opposite. You know, we can't all be rich philanthropists or scientists looking to cure cancer, but we can do our part as individuals, even if it's just to spread a little positivity, to be kind, do whatever we can to help those around us. Whether it's the homeless guy on the corner or the elderly neighbor who just lost their spouse, or even just put on a brave face for our own families. In another one of McCarthy's novels, The Road, which, by the way, is also a very dark story, there's still an underlying theme of light and goodness. We see it in the boy as the bearer of the fire. Now, from what I always understood this to mean was that he sort of symbolized the flame of humanity, or even to a certain degree, divinity, hope in a hopeless world. a living embodiment of all the good in society, and his father was the one passing the torch. You can see this theme repeated in No Country for Old Men, which was also written by Cormac McCarthy. If you've seen the movie, there's a scene at the very end with Tommy Lee Jones as Sheriff Ed Tom Bell, discussing a dream he had the night before with his wife. I'll drop a link below if you'd like to watch the entire scene, but in the dream, Sheriff Bell was on horseback, going through the mountains. It was cold and dark, but his father was there, and his father just sort of rode past him without saying a word, and the sheriff notices that he has his head down. He was all wrapped up in a blanket, but in his hands, he was carrying fire and a horn, like they used to do in the old times. Sheriff Bell could see the light glowing from the horn, described it as the color of the moon, and he knew in his dream that his father was riding on ahead to start a fire, somewhere out there in all that dark and all that cold. And he knew whenever he got there, his father would be there. And then he woke up. The end. Now, I won't pretend to be a smart man or to even half-ass understand what the hell Cormac McCarthy meant with all these analogies, but I do believe that a similar fire or light does exist within all of us. It's that unseen thing, whatever you want to call it, that gives us hope and strength and love, that sustains us through the hard times. And I don't believe it's possible for that fire to die out unless we allow it to. Pain won't kill it, and neither will sickness or even death. No outside force can extinguish that inner fire unless you let it. Yes, evil does exist, but so does good. And as long as we tend to our fires, that good will endure. And it's that goodness, that decency, that we can pass down to the next generation. Just to always keep it burning. So for everybody out there listening, myself included, especially myself, tend to your fire. Protect it fiercely from the John Glantons and the Judge Holdens of the world, and all those metaphorical cannibals. Now, how exactly you go about doing that, I can't really say. I think it's most likely different for all of us. For me, it meant putting down the bottle, and even that doesn't always work. It's a damn daily process of me not giving in to my own debauched urges. Maybe you need to quit social media. Maybe you need to log off the internet, forget about politics, find a hobby or a religion or charity to throw yourself into. I don't know. All I know is that fire inside of you is perhaps the most valuable thing that any of us possess. And I hope and pray that we all do whatever we can to protect it and to protect our loved ones, and if possible, to spread it. And if we do that, then it's my opinion that the John Joel Glantons and the Judge Holdens of the world don't stand a fucking chance. All right, I'm rambling like I know what I'm talking about, which I don't. But on a somewhat related note, there are 2 listeners of the Wild West Extravaganza who are currently going through it. One of them, Brandon, reached out recently, and his son has a rare form of cancer and is currently undergoing a marrow transplant and chemo. And then there's Dell from YouTube. I won't say his real name, but he too is fighting that big C, and not for the first time either. And he's dealing with all the side effects of chemo, the weight loss and the lethargy and all that. Both of these men introduced themselves as fans of the show, but it was clear as day from reading their messages that they are also carriers of that fire. Not even the pain of which I can't even imagine has allowed that light inside of them to dim. I could be wrong, but I'm willing to bet that sometimes these trials, like the sort that Dale and Brandon's boy are going through, can cause that fire to burn even brighter. Now, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is there ain't nothing this world can throw at us, even in a hopeless hellscape like Blood Meridian, that can stop us from doing what's right, from passing that torch. So Brandon, Dale, y'all got this. I know this may sound weird, but just from reading your messages, it inspired me to try harder to be a better person. Okay, and I think on that note, that's about all I've got on John Joel Glanton and the real Blood Meridian. Hopefully things didn't get too dark. Hopefully I didn't just ramble on for the last 10 minutes spouting nonsense. And if you're needing a palate cleanser, maybe check out the episode I did last year titled Blood Meridian, Christmas Miracle. It's about a little-known historical event that greatly contrasts with the merciless John Glanton and his bunch. As always, thank you very, very, very much for listening. If you're looking for more true tales from the Wild and Woolly West, head on over to wildwestextra.com and peruse at your leisure. Or you can check out past episodes via YouTube or any podcast app that you may have at your disposal. Speaking of podcast apps, do me a favor. If you or a loved one are in possession of an iPhone, please leave the Wild West Extravaganza a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. I normally do not ask for reviews. I probably won't ever ask again, but I am trying to drum up numbers over there on Apple Podcasts, and your reviews would definitely help out in the form of social proof. And plus, I just like hearing from you. All right, till next time, try not to scalp anybody, okay? Don't go throwing no orgies out in the desert, and please, in all seriousness, tend to your fire. Adios.